I'm Dungeon Dandy, and in this video I'm going to be talking about why I think dungeon crawls have a place in your home games. Dungeons can sometimes get a bad rap, as too limiting, as not allowing for much character roleplay or story building. I am here to argue the exact opposite. I think dungeons are great opportunities to roleplay your character, to really test them. How well do they work in a group? What are they afraid of? How cautious are they? How risky? What are they willing to do? As a GM, dungeons are useful. They're little microcosms, little mini settings to put within your own world. You can easily adapt a dungeon module to your home game, or just write your own dungeon crawl and situate your characters there. To make my case, I'm going to be talking about a game my dad ran for me and some other players about a year ago, as well as my own experience running dungeons. The module my dad ran was B1 in Search of the Unknown, the Goodman Games conversion. B1 is a fun adventure. It's classic D&D dungeon crawling. But I think the way my dad ran it is what made the game special. And that's really what I'm here to advocate to you today. One of the things my dad did to make the game interesting was come up with a shared backstory for the characters. My dad was really hooked by the idea of an all-dwarf party, really inspired by Tolkien fantasy and stories like The Hobbit. So that's what we were. All dwarves from the mountain community of Shatterforge, searching for treasure to rebuild our long broken adamantine forge. I played Magnus Barrelbrow, dwarven forge cleric of Moradin, and grandfather to two of the player characters. Other characters in the group involved dwarves of various lineages. We were all related in some way, cousins. In the dungeon, we were motivated to work together, and to keep exploring. Every gold piece we picked up was a gold that could go back to our town. Our dwarves were in search of an adventuring party that had left Shatterforge a long time ago. We were sent out to rescue them, or find their remains, as well as the treasure they were after, the tombs of the adventurers Rogan and Zeligar, who long in days past had saved Shatterforge from a horde of barbarians. Is any of this dwarven history in the module? No. My dad came up with it. He came up with the world, he came up with a story, we all had these shared characters, we had this epic dwarf quest about rebuilding our town. Wasn't in the module. We still did it. I view this as an example of how dungeons serve as neutral spaces for you to project your own story onto. You can pick up a dungeon module and adapt it like my dad did, or just come up with a dungeon and put it in your world. The point being, though, is that you can adapt the dungeon to your characters rather than make your characters fit a certain mold for your story. Additionally, this game was fun because of the style of play we engaged in. Our sessions were short, only about 2 hours each, and at the time for me, that was great. It meant that I didn't get burned out as the session dragged on. I was in a lot of games at the time that would run for hours and hours, and by the end of it I would just feel like, oh man, I can't do this anymore. The simplicity of dungeon crawling makes life almost easier in a way. I call this a relaxing playstyle. Sure, there's tension of being in the dungeon, but what I mean is that we were able to just show up and have fun, explore the dungeon, roleplay with one another, and search for treasure. It was relaxing for the GM, my dad, because he was able to front load a lot of the work. He was able to take pictures of the maps and upload them to Roll20, put in monster tokens, and when each week came around, he would be ready to run the game and we'd be ready to play. I view the ability to front load the work for a dungeon very important as a GM. It means that you can sort of prep a dungeon floor and then upload it online or just have it in your notes on paper, and then each week you're ready to go. Between sessions, you can adjust things on a minor level. In the dwarf game my dad ran, these adjustments would take the form of new rivalries between monsters. He'd noticed that during one particular session, we really despised this one gnome sorcerer that was attacking us. So eventually he built up this other narrative that there were other gnomes in there, and we'd have these conflicts with the gnomes as time progressed. I identify the ability to do a lot of prep and then run the game as letting the module run its course. You've done all the hard work at one point, and then when you show up to run the game for your players, you can sort of let things happen and make these minor adjustments. I find that it's much easier to let the module run its course when you're working with something like a dungeon crawl. Whenever I run D&D using pre-made content, I find it a lot easier to work with something like a dungeon module than a big campaign. By that I mean I can prep the dungeon, get my maps together, and then just take it from there. When I'm working with a big campaign book that's hundreds of pages, it's very hard for me to really grasp what's going to happen. I view dungeon crawls as sandboxes for you to explore in, and I think as a GM, it means that you're much less stressed out. You don't really have to worry about a big campaign story being ruined. The players can mess around with the dungeon in whichever way they want, but the dungeon is small enough that you're able to wrap your head around what they might do to some extent. There's only so many rooms. The neutral space of the dungeon serves as a playground for the players, while still being manageable enough for the GM. So what can a dungeon be used for? I view dungeons as serving three core functions. Firstly, they establish an aspect of your setting. Dungeons elaborate on bad guys. They have their own lore. There are things there in the dungeon now. How did they get there? Why? How does this fit into your broad picture of the game? Secondly, dungeons serve to test your players and their characters. The characters that get put in a dungeon are almost in like a pressure cooker of sorts. What's going to happen once they're in there? Maybe they're low on resources and light, and there are monsters lurking at every corner. What happens to those characters? Dungeons also serve as fun combat encounters. There can be cool traps, cool monsters, things to avoid, things to confront. Thirdly, and I believe that this is the key aspect of a dungeon has cool treasure. There is a cool thing there for you to discover. It doesn't have to be gold. It could be a magic item, or it could be a secret. Dungeons can contain secrets, bits of hidden and forbidden lore in your setting, pieces of guarded information. For example, maybe a tomb to an ancient lich king, and deep down in the depths of the dungeon, forbidden magic that must be kept hidden, the methods to which to become a lich. Whenever I've ran broad campaigns and used pre-built modules like really big books, I've often run into the trouble of players not really caring about a key aspect of the story. And when the players don't care about this key aspect of the story, it kind of falls apart. With a dungeon, I think it's much more easy to get your players to buy into the concept. There are plenty of reasons to come up with for why somebody might be going into a dungeon, why somebody might want treasure or knowledge, or just combat experience. Take what my dad did, for example. He came up with this whole dwarf history. I think you can take even B1 into the unknown and come up with dozens and dozens of different sort of quests that can revolve going after the tombs of Rogan and Zeligar. What I'm also advocating for here is exploration-based play. The relaxing style of play I identified earlier comes from the ability to just explore. A lot of pressure is sort of taken off you as a player when you're free to just engage with the world how you want, and that's what a dungeon is good for. On a macro level, this exploration-based play can apply to things like hex crawl campaigns, when you're really exploring the wilderness, and maybe there's a wizard tower out there, and there's a dungeon over here, and there's a thing over there. Really what I'm getting at is the difference between saying as a GM, I have a world I want to show, versus I have a story I want to tell. In an exploration style game, it's just a cool world that the players get to mess with however they want. You as a GM can kind of throw out lines of bait, little plot hooks, and whichever ones the players bite onto are the ones you should probably run with. But it's very free as a GM to not have a set plot in mind, but rather a cool world, or just a cool dungeon. As a player, this is freeing because you can really do what you want without having the pressure to follow a big narrative plot that you didn't really sign up for. I mean, think about it. You buy a big campaign module. You're off to go kill the vampire lord. Okay, well, you have to have the players sort of care about that. But if there's a world, the players can follow whichever sort of plot they want. I've had the most fun running dungeon crawls when I've worked with pre-built adventures, largely because I can fit them into my own game, and the pressure is sort of taken off me to map out the dungeon and populate it with monsters. I can adapt the story to whatever I wish, but just having that dungeon there is really nice. Dungeon modules can be short or long, to whichever style you prefer as a GM. But I especially appreciate the dungeons that only take maybe a few levels of play and are really just easy to manage, maybe 20 pages or so. I find that's far easier to prep for this than it is to prep for this broad campaign. So if I just populate my map with cool little places and a dungeon here and there, I can just take the players to the dungeon and not really worry so much. I've particularly enjoyed running dungeon modules from Goodman Games, specifically for the system Dungeon Crawl Classics and Mutant Crawl Classics. Both of these are great RPGs and I'll be making videos on them later, but I think both of these systems are really good at just that style of play. I pick up a PDF or even a little pamphlet of a 20-page adventure, or I print it out, and then I flip through it over a day or two. I upload my maps to Roll20 if I'm running online, or map them out on paper, and then I'm just good to go. It's a very relaxing thing for me to do as a GM, to kind of just know my world and then let my players play in that sandbox. If you're looking for dungeons to run, I really do suggest turning to Goodman Games and DCC as a system, as well as, if you want to get kind of wacky with it, Mutant Crawl Classics. MCC uses the Dungeon Crawl Classic system and just has a sort of science fantasy tone to it. Similarly to how I said in my last video that the simplicity of Whitehack was a strength and actually lent room to creativity, I believe that the simplicity of a dungeon crawl and that sort of old school style of play lends a lot of room for creative freedom as a player. You might not think this at first, but really treat the dungeon as a sandbox, as a thing for you as a player to mess up. I believe that there's room in D&D for big narrative campaigns and books that are hundreds and hundreds of pages, as well as small little dungeon adventures. I think these two things can coexist with one another, and they're both good styles of play. I just want to advocate for the small dungeon, for the smaller, more local story as a method for running or playing in D&D. If I can make one last argument, it's this. If you're a GM, run a game in which the players get to explore. Dungeons are really good for this, as well as hex maps and things of your own creation. If you're a player, treat the dungeon as an opportunity to roleplay your character. People might not think that there are ways to roleplay your character in combat, but I think how you fight says a lot about you. I'll link below to some dungeon modules I enjoy, as well as links to Mutant Crawl and Dungeon Crawl Classics. Be sure to check those out and really support Goodman Games. I think they're doing a lot of the work for the D&D space that WotC kind of isn't doing. I don't know why Goodman Games is putting out the classic adventures in a 5e format and not Wizards, but I'm grateful for it. So support Goodman Games, run some dungeon modules of your own, create a dungeon, put your players in it, create a little local world for them to explore in. Everybody, thank you for watching this video. Thank you for supporting my last video. I just bought a camera and I'm hoping to sort of improve things around here. So thank you again. If there are any sort of videos you want me to make sure to tell me in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing what you're thinking, how you're reacting to the stuff I'm making. If you're interested in hearing about my own campaign stories, let me know and I'll be sure to make those videos. Thank you everybody. This is Dungeon Dandy signing off.